Welcome. Tonight, we're diving into the more unsettling side of ancient Rome. Beyond the engineering marvels and legal foundations, Rome also pioneered some truly bizarre, theatrical, and often horrifying methods of punishment. Before we delve into these grim tales, if you enjoy this content, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing. I'd also love to hear in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always great to connect with a global audience. Now let's set the mood. Dim the lights, maybe put on some quiet background noise, and prepare for a journey into the past. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins held immense spiritual importance, almost like a vital public utility. Their downfall was believed to bring disaster upon the entire city. These women were chosen as girls before puberty to serve the goddess Vesta and maintain her eternal flame. Their crucial duty was to keep this sacred fire burning, and perhaps even more critically, to remain chaste for 3 decades. Breaking this vow of chastity was not just a social misstep. It was considered an act of catastrophic betrayal, akin to an attack on the state itself. If a Vestal was found to have violated her oath, the penalty was a literal burial alive. No euphemisms, no mere confinement, she was physically entombed underground. The reason for this particular form of execution was rooted in Roman religious belief. Spilling a Vestal's blood was thought to offend the gods. So, they devised a grim workaround. A pit would be dug, and the accused Vestal would be lowered in with a meager supply of provisions. A flickering oil lamp, some bread, and a small amount of water, because even in death, a nod to basic needs. The pit was then sealed. This method avoided bloodshed, maintaining ritual purity while ensuring her demise. She would be left to perish in the darkness, a stark reminder of the gravity of her broken vow. Interestingly, the men involved in such transgressions usually faced a quicker, though still brutal, public flogging to death. Despite this terrifying consequence, becoming a Vestal was a prestigious honor. They enjoyed privileges like prime seating at public games, travel in special carriages, and even the unique power to pardon condemned individuals with a single word. However, all these benefits came with the absolute condition of unwavering chastity. One transgression meant a permanent subterranean resting place. Rome's commitment to this rule was absolute, as demonstrated by the case of Cornelia during Emperor Domitian's reign. Accused, she defiantly proclaimed her innocence, challenging Caesar himself. Her plea was ultimately in vain. So, the next time your job feels overwhelming, at least remember you're not facing the prospect of being interred with stale rations for a mistake. Roman HR policies were indeed etched in stone, enforced by fear. Ah, ancient Rome, the cradle of philosophy, stunning architecture, and punishments that seem ripped from a nightmare. Let's delve into the poena culli, or penalty of the sack. This wasn't some ancient game show. It was the chilling fate for the ultimate Roman offense, parricide, the killing of one's father. For such an unthinkable crime, simple imprisonment or a fine was insufficient. Instead, the Romans devised a truly elaborate and agonizing punishment involving the condemned and 4 unfortunate animal companions. First, the parricide's hands would be bound, allowing a moment to contemplate their grave error. Then they were sewn into a large leather sack. But they weren't alone. Inside, joining them were a dog, symbolizing the loyalty they lacked, a monkey, for added chaos, a snake, representing deceit, and a rooster, perhaps to herald their final moments. The sack, now a writhing, panicked bundle of human and animal, was then cast into a river, preferably a deep one. The result was a terrifying, thrashing, and cacophonous struggle of terror and twisted justice. The precise symbolic meaning behind these specific animals remains debated by historians, but the general consensus points to representations of the perpetrator's sins made manifest. Imagine the horrifying final moments within that sack, being attacked by a monkey, a snake coiling around a leg, a dog frantic with fear, and a rooster crowing amidst the chaos. If this sounds like the worst escape room scenario ever conceived, you're not far off. This punishment was rare, thankfully, but Rome would occasionally revive it, particularly under emperors who relished dramatic displays of justice. It wasn't merely about executing the criminal. It was about delivering a powerful message, and, perhaps, deeply unsettling the onlookers. So the next time your father tells a bad joke or forgets your birthday, be grateful you weren't living in ancient Rome. There, parricide wasn't something therapy could fix. It meant sack time, with a menagerie of fear. The word crucifixion typically conjures an image of a person nailed to a wooden cross, enduring a slow, painful death as a public deterrent. It was Rome's signature capital punishment, brutal, public, and utterly degrading. Yet the Romans, with their flair for the dramatic, occasionally introduced a macabre twist, the inverted crucifixion. Yes, upside down. Because apparently, dying upright wasn't deemed humiliating enough. This method was reserved for particularly egregious cases, typically criminals, traitors, and stubborn rebels who continued their defiance even in the face of death. Perhaps the most renowned instance of an inverted crucifixion is that of St. Peter, one of Jesus' apostles. Tradition holds that when Peter was sentenced to crucifixion under Emperor Nero, he requested to be crucified head down, claiming he was unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. Rome, ever efficient, granted his unusual wish. Here's where the horror intensifies. Crucifixion itself was already one of the most agonizing forms of death, combining asphyxiation, blood loss, and profound public shame. Flipping the body inverted the dynamics of suffering. Blood rushed to the head, muscles strained unnaturally, and breathing became almost impossible, amplifying the torment significantly. It's the difference between a dull lecture and enduring that same lecture upside down while nails are driven into your ankles. Beyond the heightened suffering, there was symbolism. An inverted cross, ironically, came to represent humility, a testament to Peter's reverence rather than rebellion. Unfortunately, this powerful image has since been recontextualized by horror films and metal bands, altering its public perception. For the Romans, however, the symbolism was secondary to the message. Defy us, and your death will be as strange and unforgettable as possible. So the next time you find yourself hanging out, hopefully not literally, remember that ancient Rome could transform any punishment into a morbid form of performance art. Upside-down crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was a death with a theatrical director. Forget modem corporate team building, ancient Rome had a far more brutal method for fostering discipline: decimation. If a Roman military unit displayed cowardice, mutinied, or attempted desertion, their commander had a horrifying recourse. The entire unit would be assembled, and then, for every 10 soldiers, one would be randomly selected by lot. That lucky individual was then beaten to death by their 9 comrades using clubs, stones, or anything at hand. This wasn't just about facing death. It was about being forced to kill your own fellow soldier, someone you'd likely shared meals and campaigns with, all to reinforce loyalty to Rome. It was a twisted game of survival where there were no winners, only trauma. The surviving 9 weren't rewarded. Instead, they received barley rations instead of the usual wheat, a clear sign of the military's displeasure, and were forced to camp outside the safety of the fort. The cold logic behind decimation was strikingly effective. Instill a greater fear of your own comrades than of the enemy, and soldiers would hesitate to flee. This brutal method was instrumental in maintaining the legendary discipline of Roman legions, even if it meant stepping over a few bodies to do so. A notable instance of decimation was by Crassus, the wealthy general who joined forces with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Following a humiliating defeat during the Spartacus slave revolt, he decimated a disgraced unit, proving that in Rome, getting back on track could involve a sanctioned internal massacre. So the next time your boss talks about team accountability, be thankful you're not under the command of Crassus. In ancient Rome, failure wasn't just punished, its consequences were terrifyingly shared. Fast forward to the later Roman Empire, when the era became increasingly focused on religious heresy. If you dared to challenge church doctrine or sacred beliefs, Rome had a particularly uncomfortable accessory waiting for you: the fork of heretics. Imagine a metal bar with a 2-pronged fork at each end, one end pressed upwards under your chin, the other jammed downwards into your upper chest. This sinister device created a miniature metal sandwich around your neck. Once strapped on, moving your head was impossible without inflicting pain. Look down and you'd be stabbed, nod off, stabbed. Even a whispered heretical thought could result in a jab from your own collar. Crucially, it wasn't designed to draw blood immediately. Its true purpose was to inflict profound mental, physical, and spiritual exhaustion. Victims were often left standing for days, every muscle strained, desperately trying to avoid self-impaling. It was a torturous game of stillness, where the prize was avoiding slowly skewering your own throat. Though called the Fork of Heretics, it was also used on blasphemers, witches, suspected liars, and anyone who simply annoyed a bishop. It was a versatile instrument of torture designed for enforced silence, immobility, and soul-crushing discomfort. To enhance the drama, some forks were even engraved with Latin phrases like, "I renounce my sin," or "I am guilty," effectively tombing the act of confession into a slow, typographic impalement. What's truly unsettling is that this punishment wasn't even considered one of Rome's most extreme. It was more like an introductory course for sinners. No bloodshed, no public execution, just quiet suffering and internal panic, a form of agony, 101. So, if you've ever struggled to hold back a sneeze in a quiet meeting, imagine doing so for 3 days straight, with iron spikes pressing against your throat. In Rome, silence wasn't golden. It was enforced with 2 rusty prongs and a neck cramp from the gods. Forget modern social media unfollows or cutting someone off. In ancient Rome, if you betrayed the state, they literally threw you off a cliff. This was the fate awaiting traitors at the Tarpeian Rock, an imposing 80-foot drop on the southern face of the Capitoline Hill, just a short distance from the Roman Forum. It was more than just a scenic overlook. It was where the Republic dispatched its traitors, sending them hurtling into oblivion with dramatic flair. The rock got its grim name from Tarpeia, a Roman maiden who famously betrayed the city to the Sabine enemies in exchange for what she believed would be golden bracelets. The Sabines, taking her literally, crushed her with their shields instead, fulfilling their promise in a horrifying manner. Her body was then flung from the cliff, and the rock was named in her honor. The moral of the story: don't trust invaders or vague payment plans. Thereafter, the Tarpeian Rock became Rome's preferred method for dealing with traitors, corrupt officials, false witnesses, and anyone who earned the state's most severe displeasure. There was no hanging or sword, just a short, terrifying flight and an abrupt end. The condemned were often stripped, paraded through the streets, and then marched to the edge, where gravity delivered the sentence. Large crowds typically gathered to witness these executions, tombing them into public spectacles that enlivened market days. It was a public, final, and deeply symbolic act, the ultimate cancel culture of Rome, physically and spiritually removing individuals from the city. Interestingly, the rock was situated near the Temple of Jupiter, meaning that those who betrayed gods or state had a fleeting final glimpse of the heavens before their demise. While more elaborate punishments like lion attacks, crucifixions, and burning tunics emerged over time, the Tarpeian Rock remained a classic, elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its message. So the next time someone says they threw him under the bus, remind them the Romans did it first, using stone, not wheels, with echoes of betrayal ringing through the hills. Welcome to the Colosseum, a place of stone, sweat, and 50,000 roaring spectators, ancient Rome's equivalent of primetime entertainment. Tonight's feature, Damnatio ad Bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, essentially being fed to wild animals while the crowd enjoyed snacks. This gruesome punishment was Rome's standard for criminals, traitors, prisoners of war, and, most tragically, Christians who refused to worship imperial gods. Make no mistake, this wasn't just about execution, it was about spectacle. Rome had no patience for dull deaths, they demanded theater. The condemned were thrown into the arena, where hungry lions, leopards, bears, or even elephants awaited. But in true Roman fashion, there was often a chilling twist. Victims were frequently dressed up, transforming their deaths into macabre morality plays. An unfortunate soul might be costumed as Orpheus, only to be mauled mid-lyre performance. Another might portray a mythological villain like Prometheus, enduring accurate reenactments of birds pecking at him. It was a blend of entertainment, justice, and religious propaganda, all wrapped in a fur-covered disaster. Did the victims have any chance to defend themselves? Absolutely not. This wasn't a trial. It was a death sentence amplified by applause. The crowd craved blood, and if the animals seemed lethargic, Romans had methods to liven them up, like poking them with hot irons or starving them for days beforehand. The show, after all, had to go on. And remember, this fate wasn't reserved solely for hardened criminals. You could end up in the arena for theft, political dissent, or simply for being on the wrong side of religious law. The only thing standing between you and becoming lion lunch was the favor of a generous emperor. Yet this wasn't mere sadism. It was a calculated display, a stark warning to all onlookers. Step out of line, and this could be your fate. Rome maintained order through fear, often delivered by felines. Over time, Christian martyrs ironically transformed these beastly deaths into symbols of honor. But for most, damnatio ad bestias was less about glory and more about gore. So the next time you grumble about jury duty, be glad it doesn't involve dressing up as a mythical figure and dodging leopards. In ancient Rome, a death sentence didn't always mean being dragged to the arena or hurled from a cliff. Sometimes, if you were fortunate, or more accurately, politically well-connected, you received a peculiar form of punishment, forced suicide. It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? We won't kill you, but we strongly suggest you do it yourself. This was the option often extended to senators, nobles, or anyone high enough in Roman society to hold significant status, particularly if they had gravely offended the emperor, perhaps by plotting a coup or simply existing too confidently. Such an individual would receive a discreet visit. A scroll would be delivered, conveying a polite message from the emperor, essentially stating, "You have dishonored the state. Please choose the honorable route out." The implicit translation, "Kill yourself by sunset, or we will do it for you, and it won't be pretty." The grim upside was that compliance often meant your family retained your property, and your name might even be left unblemished in official records. It was Rome's version of a severance package, but with blood instead of paperwork. Far from being a humiliation, this act was often viewed as noble. Many elites saw it as a final act of control, a chance to dictate their own ending, sometimes even literally. Picture a warm bath, a blade to the wrist, and a final, dramatic monologue, very much in line with Rome's love of theater. The philosopher Seneca the Younger famously faced this fate. Accused, possibly falsely, of conspiring against Nero, he was ordered to end his own life. He slit his wrists, then his ankles, but the bleeding was slow, so he drank poison, which also failed. Finally, he entered a hot bath to accelerate his demise. Less a suicide, more a grim chemistry experiment. Forced suicide was essentially state-sanctioned dignity, a facade of choice that masked absolute imperial power. Rome offered the illusion of honor while ensuring you were quietly erased, without a public trial or a cheering crowd, just the hiss of warm water and the silence of complicity. So, if you've ever thought your boss was passive-aggressive, imagine receiving a formal invitation to self-destruct delivered by an imperial courier. Rome didn't always kill you. Sometimes they just let you do it beautifully. If you've ever grumbled about an uncomfortable chair, ancient Rome would like to introduce you to the wooden donkey, or as it might more aptly be called, the pain pony of doom. This wasn't an actual animal, but a tall, narrow, sharply angled wooden beam, shaped like an A-frame with a razor-thin peak. The condemned, typically thieves, slaves, or rebellious soldiers, were forced to straddle it, their entire body weight pressed down on that sharp edge, directly between their legs. But it gets worse. To truly intensify the agony, weights were often tied to the person's ankles, allowing gravity to do the rest. The longer one sat, the more the beam slowly, painfully, tore into their flesh. Depending on the executioner's mood, victims could be left there for hours. While the Romans didn't invent the wooden donkey, it likely originated from earlier Middle Eastern torture traditions, they certainly adopted it with gusto. Because if there was one thing Rome excelled at, it was punishment with a side of public spectacle. This wasn't always a death sentence. Sometimes it served as a highly persuasive form of public humiliation. Imagine a bustling square. A merchant caught cheating customers now wailing atop the donkey, while children laughed and vendors sold snacks. It was a performance of pain and a life lesson all rolled into one. Even Roman generals occasionally employed it for field discipline, forcing disobedient soldiers to straddle the donkey as a grim reminder to follow orders, because nothing says morale booster quite like internal bleeding. And yes, there were occasional variations. Some donkeys were made of metal, some had spikes, and records even mention heated versions, suggesting Rome was actively refining its torture methods. It was humiliating, brutal, and transformed the simple act of sitting into a punishment that could physically and mentally scar you for life. So, the next time your office chair feels a bit stiff, remember it's not a sharp triangle, and no one's tying rocks to your feet. In ancient Rome, bad posture wasn't your biggest concern. The furniture was. In a world lacking ID cards, background checks, or digital searches, ancient Rome had a straightforward method for identifying criminals. They branded them. Yes, we're talking about literally burning a mark onto their face. If you were a thief, a runaway slave, or a repeat offender, you received a permanent facial feature that loudly proclaimed, "Do not trust this person." The branding was typically done with a heated metal rod, pressed into the skin with the brutal efficiency of a blacksmith on a deadline. Letters like F for fur, thief, or C for calumnia, false accuser, were seared onto the forehead or cheek. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a one-star Yelp review, but permanently etched onto your skull. And this wasn't a private affair. Branding was a public spectacle, a lesson for all to witness. The aim was to humiliate the criminal and deter others. It was propaganda, sizzling directly into flesh. Imagine living with that mark, walking through the market, everyone recognizing you. Trying to secure a job? Good luck. Flirting with someone? Forget it. You were no longer just a person, you were a walking crime scene. Runaway slaves were particularly targeted, often branded with the letters fug, short for fugitivus, meaning escapee. If they dared to run again, they faced harsher branding or worse. Slaves were not just property, they were expected to wear their disobedience like a badge. Some clever individuals attempted to remove or disguise the marks through cuts, tattoos, or even makeup. But Rome always, prepared, made such acts punishable too. Tampering with your brand was akin to trying to Photoshop your criminal record. It simply wasn't allowed. Later, some emperors, like Constantine, tried to temper the practice by suggesting brands be placed on hands or legs instead of the face. However, the underlying purpose remained the same: permanent public shame. So the next time someone tells you to face your consequences, be glad they don't mean that literally. In ancient Rome, your face wasn't just a mugshot, it was a constant reminder of your crime. In ancient Rome, freedom of speech was a conditional privilege. You could praise the emperor, discuss philosophy, and recite poetry. But if you dared to blaspheme, insult the emperor, or utter the wrong words in the wrong ears, you might face a terrifying and very literal punishment: tongue removal. Yes, they actually did it. The reasoning was brutally simple. If your words were deemed dangerous, Rome would silence you permanently. The procedure was far from subtle. There was no anesthesia or sterile tools, just forceps, iron, and unimaginable pain. A soldier or executioner would clamp your tongue and then either slice it off or in some cases rip it out entirely. This wasn't surgery, it was state-sanctioned censorship. While blaspheming against the gods was a common trigger, especially if you publicly mocked Jupiter or questioned sacred rituals, blasphemy often extended to speaking out against the emperor or the empire's moral order. Essentially, if your words made powerful people uncomfortable, you quickly became a medical emergency. One wrong joke, one heretical whisper, one rebellious chant and snip. This punishment wasn't just brutal, it was highly theatrical. Public tongue removals sent an unmistakable message. Words have power, but ours has more. Even if you survived the ordeal, life afterward was no picnic. You couldn't speak clearly, argue your innocence, or even scream properly. It was isolation through mutilation, a scarlet letter carved not into your skin, but into your very silence. Ironically, some of the earliest Christian martyrs endured this fate. They refused to renounce their faith and continued preaching, and Rome, unable to silence their ideas, went for the messenger, quite literally. Of course, the Christians then transformed these horrifying stories into tales of divine courage, which only further infuriated the Romans. If this sounds extreme, remember Rome's obsession with control, and there was no more effective way to control a person than by severing their voice. So, the next time someone tells you to hold your tongue, be thankful it's just a figure of speech. In ancient Rome, they meant it literally. If you thought the Romans were running out of creative ways to destroy a person, allow us to introduce the wheel, also known as the breaking wheel, or later, the Catherine wheel. This punishment was less an execution and more a macabre sculpture session, using the human body as its raw material. Here's how it worked. First, the condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, arms and legs spread out like a grotesque human starfish. Then an executioner, wielding a heavy iron bar, would begin the dreadful work of smashing the limbs, one by one, slowly and deliberately. The aim wasn't to kill quickly. No, the goal was to shatter the bones while keeping the victim alive. Arms would be snapped, thighs crushed, and ankles twisted until they were no longer recognizable. The body would fold unnaturally, becoming a horrifying display of pain and twisted precision. But the pièce de résistance? The broken body was then woven through the wheel spokes, limbs bent and threaded like a nightmarish macrame project. Sometimes the wheel was hoisted on a pole like a warning flag. Other times it was left to spin gently in the wind, adding to the grim ambiance. This wasn't just about punishment. It was a public message. Breaking on the wheel was reserved for crimes deemed especially heinous, such as murder, treason, or highway robbery. It declared to the assembled crowd, "This is what happens when you cross the line." And you didn't just die, you slowly decayed in full public view. Survivors were rare, but in a twisted display of mercy. If someone did manage to cling to life after a day or two, they might be granted a final blow to the chest or neck. Horrifyingly, this punishment outlived Rome, with medieval Europe embracing it and elevating it into an art form, adding spikes, fires, and dramatic scripts. Rome had merely set the stage. So the next time you think your commute is rough, remember you're not strapped to a wooden wheel, becoming the centerpiece of a public bone gallery. In Rome, justice wasn't blind. It was bold, brutal, and designed for maximum exposure. When it came to inventively gruesome ways to die, ancient Rome always had something simmering, quite literally. Enter one of its lesser-known but deeply disturbing punishments, execution by hot ash. It might not be as famous as crucifixion or the lions, but it could be one of the slowest and most psychologically terrifying methods ever devised. No swords, no bloodshed, no quick release, just ashes, heated, suffocating, and seemingly endless. This gruesome method is often attributed, unsurprisingly, to Emperor Nero, a man who viewed executions as performance art. In one recorded instance, Nero had an enemy buried up to the neck in a pit, a classic Roman move. But instead of beheading or stoning, Nero added his signature twist. A funnel was inserted into the man's mouth, and hot ash was slowly poured in. Not boiling water, not fire, but ash. At first glance, it seems harmless. Ashes are soft, right? But here's the insidious horror. The ash was scorching. It clogged the throat, seared the lungs, and suffocated from within. It didn't kill quickly. It choked slowly, gradually. Every moment, every breath turning to fire, every swallow becoming your last. As the ash settled, there was no external bleeding, no burns, but inside, everything was failing. It was death by dust, suffocation disguised as silence. Why ash? Because it was deeply humiliating and undignified. Ashes were the remnants of destruction, used to clean filth, to erase traces of burned things. To die in ash was symbolic. It meant you were beneath notice, unworthy of steel or flame. You weren't even deemed worthy of a dramatic death, just the slow grind of what was left over. This punishment wasn't common. It was reserved for those Nero truly despised, individuals whose very existence he wished to erase quietly, yet with maximum psychological torment. To the crowd, it looked like little, just a man in a hole and a trickle of gray dust. So the next time someone tells you ashes to ashes, dust to dust, remember that in Nero's Rome, that wasn't just poetic, it was protocol. In ancient Rome, fashion generally didn't kill unless you were wearing the tunica molesta, or as we might call it, the flammable death robe. Imagine being led into an arena or strapped to a stake. Instead of chains, an executioner approaches you with a tunic. Oh good, you might think, at least they're giving me something to wear. Then you notice it's dripping, not with water, but with pitch, tar, and oil. This is the tunica molesta, literally the annoying tunic, but more accurately a highly flammable nightmare onesie. It was a garment soaked in combustible materials, fitted snugly, and then set on fire while you were still very much alive inside it. This wasn't merely a method of execution. It was a public performance, most famously utilized by emperors like Nero, who transformed executions into after-dark entertainment. During his infamous garden parties, Nero would use the tunica molesta to illuminate the grounds, creating human torches to light his twisted vision of Roman leisure. Who wore it? Arsonists, traitors, and Christians, anyone deemed worthy of a particularly theatrical end. The flames clung to the body, melting skin, igniting hair, and searing lungs. There was no escape, no rolling to put it out. The tunic stuck to you, burning with you. And because Rome loved a good mythological reference, they sometimes modeled it after Hercules' poison shirt, a garment that caused the hero unbearable agony before his death. Rome didn't just kill you, they made it poetic. The true genius, if one can call it that, lay in the psychology. You weren't just dying, you were displayed shrieking, flailing, engulfed in fire while crowds watched. It sent a message clearer than any stone inscription. This is what happens when you cross the empire. Some records even suggest music was played during the burning. Nero reportedly plucked his lyre as the flames rose. Talk about a hot performance. So, if you ever complain that your clothes are uncomfortable or too tight, be glad they're not soaked in oil and part of a public execution ceremony. Because in Rome, fashion didn't just make a statement, it screamed. Most Roman punishments ended with the body, but some reached further, into memory, into legacy, into utter obliteration. This was damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, Rome's most haunting punishment of all. Because what could be worse than death, being purposefully forgotten? If you were an emperor who embarrassed the state, a general who rebelled, or a senator who fell too far from grace, Rome might not just kill you, they would erase you completely. Statues would be smashed or defaced, inscriptions chiseled out, portraits painted over, your name struck from official documents, coins, and monuments. If you had achievements, they were reassigned. If you had supporters, they were silenced. And the most devastating part? It worked. Many individuals subjected to damnatio memoriae were powerful, well-known, and feared. Yet today we don't even remember their names, because Rome was that effective at deletion. Entire reigns simply vanish into silence, its historical vaporization. One of the most famous examples involved Emperor Geta, brother of Caracalla. After Caracalla had him assassinated, in their own mother's arms no less, he didn't stop there. He ordered Geta's image removed from every mosaic, painting, and bust. Thousands of inscriptions were edited, his name scratched out by hand. In some surviving art, you can still see the ghost of Geta's figure. Awkward gaps, half faces, names partially scraped away. It's chilling, like history caught in the act of forgetting. But damnatio memoriae wasn't just about vengeance. It was about control. If Rome could rewrite the past, it could sculpt the future. If you could make it seem like someone never existed, then perhaps their ideas didn't exist either. It was the empire's way of saying, you were never here, and if anyone says otherwise, they'll be next. There's something terrifyingly modern about it, too. We talked today about cancel culture, social erasure, and reputations destroyed online, but Rome was doing it 2,000 years ago, just with chisels instead of tweets. So as we conclude this strange journey through Rome's most bizarre punishments, remember this. The cruelest punishment wasn't fire or lions or ropes. It was the silence that followed. Because in ancient Rome, the worst thing that could happen to you was to be forgotten. In the early 1800s, the American landscape stretched endlessly westward, wild, unknown, and brimming with promises for those brave enough to pursue them. The East, with its crowded cities, factories, and diminishing farmland, had begun to feel restrictive. But the West? That was the dream. A blank canvas with just enough danger to make the story compelling. It started as a murmur in taverns, in church pews, and around dinner tables. Whispers of vast open land, rivers shimmering like silver, and valleys that bloomed effortlessly. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 had more than doubled the size of the young United States, suddenly providing unimaginable space that, so the government claimed, belonged to no one. For many, the West was more than just a direction. It was a fresh start, a place where your name didn't carry your debts, where no one asked about your origins, only what you could accomplish with your own hands. It called to both dreamers and desperados, farmers seeking new soil, widows seeking peace, and adventurers chasing legends born of campfire tales. There were no highways, no guarantees, and no second chances. Every journey westward began with profound uncertainty. Would the wagon survive the mountains? Would the river freeze too soon? Would there be food on the other side? Yet tens of thousands embarked on this journey. Entire families, with infants swaddled in flour sacks and grandmothers tucked between crates of salted pork, set off into the unknown. To go west was to gamble everything, but to remain felt like surrendering to a life of limitations. The frontier wasn't just a place on a map. It was a test of will, of grit, of the ability to forge order from chaos, using only timber, steel, and raw hope. And as the sun dipped below endless prairies and mountain ridges, casting long shadows on wagon wheels and weary faces, one truth was clear: America's story wasn't yet written. It was being painstakingly dragged westward, one creaking mile at a time. Before the pioneers could truly brave the wild frontier, they needed a vessel that would carry not only their supplies, but their entire future. Enter the covered wagon, the very backbone of the westward migration. It was no elegant stagecoach or fancy carriage. It was a wooden box on wheels, held together by sweat, hope, and iron nails. Most families didn't construct these wagons from scratch. They purchased them or modified existing carts. While the Conestoga was famous, the frontier demanded something smaller, lighter, and more affordable. This gave rise to the Prane schooner, so named because its billowing canvas top, caught by the wind, resembled a ship sailing across grassy seas. But this ship didn't carry gold or jewels. It carried salted pork, flour, beans, cast iron pots, a spinning wheel, a Bible, and perhaps one cherished quilt. Every inch was meticulously accounted for. Space meant life, and excessive weight could be fatal. A fully loaded wagon might hold up to 2,000 pounds. Any more, and the oxen pulling it would collapse long before reaching the Rockies. Horses were too delicate, mules too expensive. Oxen were the true engines of expansion, slow, stubborn, but remarkably resilient. Families slept in the wagons, beneath them or beside them. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. And despite what Hollywood often depicts, people rarely rode inside all day. That would jostle bones and bruise backs. Most walked mile after mile, day after blistering day. Wagons were more than just transportation. They were survival pods. They contained medicines, spare wagon tongues, gunpowder, and seeds. Some even transported baby chicks in boxes beneath the wagon bed, hoping to start a flock once settled. Yet for all their practicality, these wagons were also deeply symbolic. They represented hope on wheels. Once the oxen were yoked, once the wheels creaked into motion, there was no turning back. The old house was sold, the land behind them was gone. All that remained was the trail, the vast sky, and the unwavering belief that something better lay ahead. Every bump, every cracked axle, every muddy crossing was a line written in the story of American expansion, carved not in ink, but in wheel ruts and sheer willpower. Life on the trail was far from the romantic adventure stories often imagined. It was long, grueling, and perpetually dusty. Each day began before sunrise. Roosters weren't needed, as the creak of leather harnesses and the groan of wagon wheels served as ample alarm clocks. The average wagon train covered about 10 to 15 miles per day, depending on weather, terrain, and how many axles broke that morning. Over time, routes like the Oregon, Santa Fe, and California trails etched themselves into the earth, each lined with discarded belongings, broken wheels, and the graves of those who never reached the West. Meals were simple, hearty, and endlessly repetitive. Coffee was a luxury, and water was a gamble. Streams could be pristine or teeming with bacteria. Boiling it helped if you had the fuel and time, otherwise, it was a matter of luck and prayer. Food was strictly rationed: salted meat, hardtack, dried beans, and occasionally wild game if someone was a good shot. Wild onions and berries became treasured delicacies. Illness was the greatest killer on the trail. Cholera, in particular, swept through camps like wildfire, originating from contaminated water and often proving fatal within hours. Dysentery, scurvy, and snake bites also claimed lives. There were no doctors, only home remedies and desperate hope. Sometimes, hope wasn't enough. Yet there were also moments of joy. Children played with sticks and stones or skipped alongside the wagon's shadows. Occasional weddings took place on the trail, as did births. Entire families were forged not just by blood, but by shared hardship and dust-soaked camaraderie. At night, the wagons would form a circle, not primarily to ward off Native American attacks, as often mythologized, but for protection against thieves, animals, and the biting cold wind. Fires were lit, bread was baked on hot stones, and occasionally someone would pull out a fiddle. For a few hours, laughter and music pushed back the darkness, but rest was always brief. Tomorrow brought more walking, more wilderness, and fewer guarantees. Life on the trail was survival by routine. You learned to love your boots and resent your blisters. You learned to mourn quietly and move forward regardless, because the land didn't wait for grief. It only moved west. After weeks or even months on the trail, the sight of trees, clean water, and flat land was enough to bring a pioneer to their knees in gratitude. But the celebration was short-lived, because once a family found their chosen spot, the real work began. Homesteading was far from glamorous. There were no pre-built homes, no fences, no roads, just open land and the relentless ticking clock of the seasons. The first priority was always shelter. Typically, this meant a one-room log cabin, often barely large enough for the family who built it. Tools were scarce, meaning every log had to be felled, trimmed, and hauled by hand or with oxen. There were no chainsaws or blueprints, just axes, sheer determination, and a good deal of guesswork. Most cabins had dirt floors, which transformed into mud with rain and froze solid in winter. Windows were often simple openings covered with animal hide or greased paper, allowing in some light while blocking the worst of the cold. A proper chimney was a luxury. Many cabins initially featured only holes in the roof for smoke to escape, leading to much coughing inside. Families slept on piles of straw, furs, or corn husks. Beds were rudimentary, made from rope strung across wooden frames. If they were fortunate, the gaps between the logs were sealed with mud and moss to keep out the wind. If not, the wind found its way in regardless. Then came the first winter, the season that truly tested every soul. If the family hadn't stockpiled enough firewood or food, the coming months could bring starvation or frostbite. Snowstorms might trap them indoors for days, while coyotes howled and wolves circled in the darkness. Yet the frontier spirit endured. Families leaned to make candles from animal fat, and children learned to patch clothes and cook over open fires. They read from the Bible by firelight and wrote letters home if there was even a place to send them. Neighbors were few and far between, but when a new cabin appeared on the horizon, help was readily offered. A shared roof raising, a borrowed cow, a hot meal. Survival wasn't just about individual toughness. It was about community. One family alone might not last, but 10 together stood a chance. The first winter on the frontier wasn't merely cold. It was a quiet crucible where dreams were either hardened into resolve or buried beneath the snow. On the American frontier, strength wasn't solely measured by physical muscle. It was measured in endurance, sacrifice, and a quiet, relentless courage. And no one embodied this more fully than frontier women. Forget the delicate damsels of popular fiction. These women were warriors in aprons. The moment they stepped off the wagon, they instantly became builders, farmers, midwives, butchers, doctors, and teachers, all rolled into one. If something needed doing, they did it, because there was simply no one else. They rose before dawn to churn butter, bake bread, and milk cows, often before most men even opened their eyes. They meticulously planted gardens, preserved food, tended livestock, and sewed every garment the family wore, frequently from scratch. In times of sickness, they administered herbal remedies. During childbirth, they acted as midwives, sometimes for neighbors, sometimes